Welcome back to our first real lecture of the semester. My goal is to introduce you to statistics. Well, how am I going to go about doing that? And I can think of no better way of introducing you to statistics and what we'll be covering than by telling you a definition of statistics that we'll be following. That statistics is a field that uses math plus logic to organize, analyze, and interpret data. Now, this is a perfectly serviceable definition. So we're going to be learning some math, we're going to be learning some logic, how to think, and then we're going to be doing something with numbers. We're going to be organizing the numbers, we're going to be analyzing those numbers, doing some simple testing, and most important, understanding what the numbers are telling us. So this is a great definition to start with, but it's not very inspirational, right? I think I could do better. This definition is from a statistician, Todd Little, and he describes statistics as the point at which common sense meets logic, where numbers convey ideas. The point where common sense meets logic, the point where what I think I know and what should be true matches with what the evidence actually shows me. That point is where we start learning about the world through numbers. Now, this definition I like even better. Statistics is the art and the science of making sense of data. It's an art. I'm going to teach you some of the scientific principles and the techniques, but it's an art to understand what is really being revealed in those numbers. And I find that particularly exciting, to be able to look at numbers, to look at outcomes and say, here's what's really going on within these numbers. Because what that allows me to do is understand the world a little bit better. And it allows me to do it in a way that some people might be skeptical of. How can you really understand the world just from this table of numbers? But I can. I can see insights. I can understand the world through numbers. That is the field of statistics. So hopefully, with those definitions, you have a little clearer idea what we're going to be talking about, but also, it's not just going to be learning math. It's not just going to be using software. We're going to be learning things that apply in the real world. I do my own research. Now, I know you may have heard people say that. I do my own research. And really what some people mean when they say I do my own research is not real research. They are watching YouTube videos or reading blogs or following ideas that just support what they already believe. If what you are doing is being served up to you through an algorithm on a social media site, my friends, you are not doing research. And remember those algorithms? Those are designed for a purpose, and that purpose is engagement. And what engagement means is they just want you to comment. They want eyeballs on the screen. And you know the best way to get people engaged is by making them mad. If you piss them off, they'll engage. And that drives eyeballs to advertisers. Might be great for making money, might not be so great for society. So when I say I do my own research, I really do. I do scientific research. Now, scientific research is not a literature review. It's not simply reading or watching videos. The reading can certainly be part of scientific research. In fact, it's a required part of scientific research because I need to know where I started and I need to know where I need to begin my project. So what I mean is, I'm going to read a journal article that tells me what is already known. The best that can do is get me right up to the cutting edge of what is known in science right now. And then I'm going to look for a gap in the literature of what is yet unknown, and that's where I start doing my own research, the scientific research of moving us forward so that we're learning something that previously we didn't know. Research, the way I'm describing it, is a set of procedures for collecting, organizing, analyzing, and interpreting numeric data. So collecting. I have to get these numbers from somewhere. I'm going to go out and ask people questions. Maybe I'm going to give them a standardized survey. I'm going to ask them to respond. I'm going to get those numbers. And then I want to organize them into a data set so that I can actually see what's in there. I can analyze those numbers and look for the patterns that exist. Having analyzed the data, that's where the fun begins. Interpreting what is really there. The good news in a class like this, beginning statistics, is those first two are already going to be done for you. I've already done the data collection. I've already organized it into data sets. I'm going to give you beautiful, clean data sets to use. And then I'll teach you how to analyze those data sets. The point here is to give you a set of skills that you can use so that you can replicate this skill set on your own data, if you ever do your own data collection. Scientific research, when you're doing it right, is generating knowledge. We know more than we used to know as the result of the work that you put in collecting and organizing and analyzing and interpreting those data. People who say, I do my own research, most of the time, that type of I do my own research is generating beliefs, not knowledge. In other words, it's reinforcing things that are already believed, not introducing new information that could change the way that we think about the world and the way that we believe. The reason why we are able to take what we learn from our research and put it out there, knowing that it's more than just me telling you my opinion, is because we go through a process called peer review. And that means I write a beautiful article. It's practically perfect. And I send it in to the journal, and the editor of that journal sends it out to 2 or 3 reviewers who read my article and tear it apart. It's so unfair. They tell me anything that I got wrong. They tell me if my methodology isn't correct. They question how I did the analysis and why I chose the analysis that I did. They just rip it to shreds. And it's so unfair, but you know, doggone it, every time I go through that process, I find something that's like, you know, they kind of had a point. Yeah, they did. And the result is my research gets better, and I have something that is clearer and something that is better defined and more defensible as the result of going through the peer review process. If you ever go through this process, just know that it's not fun, not easy, but it is the best way to sort out mistakes, errors that we might have made, and fix them. Because science is self-correcting. That means when I find something, or the reviewer finds something in my article that is not correct, that is wrong, that is unexpected, I've got to fix that. You see, when I find something that doesn't agree with what I want to be true, what I already believe, I've really got 2 choices. I can either just ignore that, or I can change what I believe. And science is all about correcting errors. What will happen is sometimes there will be a journal article or some scientific process, something scientific that says, science now believes this. We used to believe that, now we believe this. When that happens, it's not because science was lying to you. It's because science learned something new. And the evidence shows that that thing that we used to believe, there's more to the story than what we thought, and we are moving forward by correcting previous errors. Scientific research is available to everyone. When I publish an article, you can read it. And I can't control who reads it or what they think about it. I'm putting it out there. You can look at it. The open science framework is an emphasis now in science of putting out not just the article, the data, the code, everything that you did so that other people can see what you've done, replicate it, look for errors so that we're really moving forward rather than just maybe cherry picking some data that hopefully shows us what we want to hear, tells us what we want to hear. We're doing science in a very open and transparent way. So when I say to you, I do my own research, what I'm saying is I'm engaging in this process by which I gather information, data, I analyze it, I do my best to interpret it, I let other people pick it apart, find anything that's wrong with it, and hopefully result in something that we now know something more than we did before I started doing my research. Statistical research is built on data. What does that mean? The data are the facts, the numbers that we use to do research. We're going to be collecting numbers. We're going to be analyzing those numbers. We're going to be inferring meaning from those numbers. Let me explain how that process works by telling you something that I think you already know, and that is numbers. I'm going to introduce you to numbers. Do you remember the first time that you encountered numbers? You probably don't, because you were very, very young. You might have still been in infancy. And somebody, through toys, shapes, puzzles, for me it was wooden blocks, somebody introduced you to numbers. They gave you something that you have been using ever since infancy. And the first thing that you learned was when you play with those blocks, you can organize them, you can arrange them. But those symbols on the blocks have different meanings. And you can use those symbols in a variety of ways. So for instance, we can answer questions about how many or how much. And what might happen is someone asks you, how old are you? And you hold up 2 or 3 fingers, or sometimes 2.5 fingers to indicate, how old are you? How tall are you? Which we could measure in inches or centimeters. We're measuring something, quantifying. We are quantifying information about you. But I can also use that to organize the world, like what grade are you in? First, second, third, fourth. You see, how many friends do you have? How many kids are in your class? Those kinds of questions can be answered as we get better at numbers. So if we're going to use numbers skillfully, we'll need to have some techniques, a skill set to use. And that first level skill set is going to be called descriptive statistics. Descriptive statistics organize and summarize the data that we have to work with. How does that summarization work? How do we actually organize data so that we and others can understand it? Sometimes we use tables. We put numbers into tables like frequencies. And sometimes we use individual numbers like averages, means, standard deviations. And sometimes we create pictures. We create bar charts or pie charts or histograms to actually show, to depict the data. All of those examples are descriptive statistics. So in the same ways I might describe a person, I could describe the data. Where is the center of the data? How much spread is in the data? What does that distribution of data actually look like? Then the second skill set we're going to learn is inferential statistics, where we draw conclusions based on what we have learned from our descriptive statistics. You see, if we're looking for an example of how statistics really works, we could start with something as simple as cooking dinner. We are cooking a pot of stew. We got a kettle of stew, and I want to know something about that kettle of stew. Is it ready to serve? How am I going to make that determination? I want to know, are the potatoes cooked well? Does the pearled barley need a few more minutes cooking? Is it properly seasoned? Is there enough salt? I want to know answers to those questions. I want to know about the entire population, the entire kettle. So to find the answers, do I have to eat the entire kettle? No. Do I have to eat a bowl full to get those answers? No. I can tell from a very small sample everything that I need to know. I can tell, are the potatoes cooked properly? Does it need more salt? Does the barley need more time? I can tell all of that information from a small sample, as long as one thing is true of that sample. As long as my sample is representative. That means that every element contained in the population is in the sample. If I draw a sample that contains everything except for the potatoes, I can still tell you a lot about that population, but I'm blind to that one element in the population. And I might say, well, I know enough about everything else, I can make some guesses. Let's not be too hasty. If I have not sampled properly, then what I learn from my sample gives me limited information about the population. I need to have a representative sample to really show you the population values. The best way to get a representative sample is to use a random sample. Now, unfortunately, a random sample doesn't guarantee representativeness, but it's the best way of getting there. It's where everyone has an equal chance of being in the sample. Every element of the population has an equal chance of being chosen. So let's cook up some inferences. There are three methodologies that I want to teach you about. The first one is quantitative. That is where we use numeric data, like surveys and statistics, to understand the world. This is the kind of research method that I like the most. It's the one with the numbers. It's the one where we use statistical software. But it is not the only way that I could understand the world. I could also use qualitative research methods, which would be focus groups, interviews. I could sit down and talk to you and gather information. The way that I analyze that information is going to be slightly different. I'm going to be using text analysis instead of using statistics. Or what I could do is combine them and use mixed methodology, where I ask you open-ended questions, but I also have you fill out a standardized survey. And I get a broader sense of what I want to know about you and what you have to tell me about how the world works. So those are our three methodologies. We're going to be focusing on the quantitative methodology, doing statistics, but we'll be using qualitative data for sure. A lot of the grouping data, the numeric, the nominal level data that we'll be using, that would all fall within that category. So let me explain the research process in a larger sense. Anytime I'm doing research, I want to know about a population, that entire group about which I want to know something. But I can't sample the entire population, just like I don't want to eat the entire kettle of stew. What I will do, however, is using proper sampling methodology, select a random sample where I'm choosing elements from throughout that population, and those elements I bring together into a smaller subset, which is called a sample. It is the population in miniature. In fact, if I've done my sampling correctly, then what is true of the population should be true of any sample drawn from that population. In other words, the mean of the population should be the same as the mean of any sample that I've drawn. And conversely, if I draw a sample, what is true of that sample should be true of the population from which it was drawn. And that allows me to make inferences. Knowing something from the sample, I can work backwards. So the thing that I'm going to be measuring is a statistic. It's some measure of the sample that I've drawn. We'll use means and standard deviations. For this example, I'll just stick to the mean, the X bar, the average of my sample. Okay. That average that I've drawn from the sample is called a statistic. But that isn't really what I want to know about. I don't really care that much about what I learned from the sample, except in what it can tell me about the population. I want to be able to take what I've learned from my sample and extrapolate it back to that population, which I can do because what is true of that sample should be true of the population from which it was drawn. I use descriptive statistics to define the sample, calculate a mean. I use inferential statistics to work back to the population. Now, the statistics that we'll be using typically are English letters, so we'll see examples like X bar for the mean, S for the standard deviation, or lowercase n for the sample size. Each of those sample statistics has a corresponding population parameter, which will typically be a Greek letter. For example, the Greek letter mu for the mean, the Greek letter sigma for the standard deviation, or a capital N for the sample size. So now we're going to shift and talk about numbers and data. And I want to tell you about the jobs that numbers can do. We're going to work through those 4 jobs, starting with the very basic things that numbers can do. They can stand in for a name. This is called nominal level data. It's a name, a label. It identifies. If you have a jersey, like that one, that might mean something to you. But the number that you see on a jersey, it tells you who someone is, but it doesn't tell you how good they are. It's not a comparable number. This number with this individual on a different team may not be as good as the number on our favorite team. So I'm using numbers to stand in for a name. Because of that, they can be either numeric or non-numeric. I could use numeric like 1 and 2, but I could also use colors like red or blue. I could use pictures like donkey and elephant. I could use letters like D and R. I could use full words, Democrat, Republican. Any of those will tell me exactly the same thing. As long as I know what the scale is supposed to mean, I can use numeric or non-numeric data to create factors in my data set. Now the numbers aren't comparable, and if the number is a 0, it's just a label. Let me give you an example. Of these 2 football players, who's the better player? We have no way of knowing. Those numbers aren't telling us anything other than just who is who, nominal level data. But if those data have some kind of underlying order, then the job that they are doing is ordinal. It not only shows differences, like nominal data, it also shows in order. Now they can also be numeric or non-numeric, so I could have 1, 2, 3 for first, second, and third, but I could also have gold, silver, and bronze, which would tell me exactly the same thing. The numbers are comparable within, but not between. Here's what that means. If you're the winner of the race, you came in first place. Were you faster or slower than the winner of that other race? We don't know. You can't compare between. Was the winner of the Daytona 500 faster or slower than the winner last year? We don't know. We know that they both came in first place, but we can't compare between the scales. Now within the scales, first, second, third means the same thing. The valedictorian of your graduating class, first in class, smarter than the valedictorian from the school across town? Well, yes, of course, but we can't compare between scales, only within scales. And 0 doesn't exist because there's no coming in 0 place. Interval level data tells amount. It tells a relative amount, which means that we can use this scale, starting anywhere on the scale, to measure something, but it doesn't have an absolute 0. It doesn't have a 0 starting point. Let me illustrate this with a story from one of my other hobbies, which is doing woodworking. So I have a really nice wood shop out at my parents' house. It's great because it's out there, it's convenient, I can get there anytime I want, but I do share it with my dad. It's my stuff, but I gotta let him use it, right? Which has some downsides sometimes, because he'll use my really high quality saw blade to cut PVC pipe. An analogy would be if you do sewing and someone were to use your sewing scissors to cut paper, have that sort of equivalency. One time, I go out to the shop and he says, yeah, I broke your tape measure. I said, you did what? He left the tape measure on something he was cutting and ended up snapping off the end of the tape measure. That little metal piece on the end is gone. Now, let's say I was in a pinch and this is the only tape measure that I have. Could I still measure a board at 16 inches? I mean, I could. Maybe I'd start at 10 and I'd measure to 26. I can still use this anywhere along the scale because the intervals are equal. So that is the quality of interval. I have an arbitrary starting point and an ending point. The intervals are what allow the scale to work. The difference between interval and ratio is that there is an absolute zero with ratio scale, which means that there is a number below which we cannot go. We cannot have negative values. There's a lot of things that go into a ratio scale. Money. Now, I know you can have a negative balance in your checking account, but not really. That just means you owe them money. There are no values below zero. We're measuring height. We have a 0 starting point at the floor, and you can't be negative inches tall. So if the measure cannot have negative values, it would be ratio. Interval measurements of temperature would be Fahrenheit and Celsius, which we can convert between those two, but they don't mean the same thing. So if you're familiar with Fahrenheit and I tell you it's 30 degrees Celsius outside, how are you going to dress? Is that hot? Is that cold? Doesn't mean the same thing. It's two different scales. What is the scale of temperature that has an absolute zero that we can't go below? The Kelvin scale. So let's review the levels of measurement so that you can organize these thoughts. When we talk about data, there are certain measures that will categorize groups. They are qualitative data, and those qualitative data can be either numeric or non-numeric. Numeric scales can be nominal or ordinal. I can use 1, 2, 3 to indicate who you are in my data set, your participant 1, 2, or 3, or I could use 1, 2, and 3 to indicate first, second, third place. But I can also use non-numeric data like colors or pictures or letters or words that will tell me exactly the same thing. Both nominal and ordinal can be represented as numeric or non-numeric. On the other hand, scale level data is quantitative or continuous, and it can only be numeric. And the two scale levels are interval and ratio. They are very, very similar. The defining difference is that ratio level data has an absolute zero, whereas interval level data does not have an absolute zero. But we want to do statistics, and to do that, we've got to organize those numbers. When we organize numbers, they become variables. A variable is something that can vary. It can take on more than one value. So I distribute a survey, and I ask you questions like, how tall are you? And everyone writes down their height in inches. And I collect all this information from you. My first question is, when you consider your height, is it a variable or is it a constant? Now, your height is a constant. It doesn't change from day to day. Your weight changes slightly from day to day, changes throughout the day. Height, very consistent. But when we are doing statistics, we are not interested in the individual level, we're looking at the group level. If I collect data on a group, is height something that can take on more than one value? Yes, that's what makes it a variable. At the group level, I can take on more than one value. When I organize my numbers, they become variables. So I want you to just pretend that you're in a stats class. That shouldn't be too hard. And we'll pretend that there's 24 students in your stats class along with you. We are going to answer some questions about the variables based on data that we've collected from each student. Subjects. These are the individuals who are studied in an experiment. Participants, elements, subjects, all means the same thing. And an observation would be a data point from a subject. Sample size is the total number of subjects. Let's apply that. Going back to our example of you being in a statistics class, who would be a subject? You are. Each one of you would be a subject, or more accurately, a participant, because we called our human subjects participants and our non-human participants subject. What would be an observation? your height or your weight or your IQ or your grade. Any information I get from you would be an observation. What would be the sample size? Which would be the total number. Do you remember how many people were in the class? 24. So we have participants who are giving us observations, and we have a total number of observations, which would be our sample size. All of the variables measure a characteristic of a subject. Quality would be qualitative, like blood type or personality or some other status, versus quantity, which would be height or weight or IQ, something to be measured on a scale. We can code these numbers as numeric or non-numeric. We can have 0, 1 for male, female, but we could have 1, 2, 3, which is SNL, something not listed, which is a good way of including everyone when you're using that gender variable. I could use a capital F and a capital M for female, male. And if I was measuring something like height, I would be using number of inches, like 65 inches, or I could use decimals, like 1.65 meters. Here's categorical variables. They are qualitative variables that indicate an attribute or belongingness to a category, which again could be words or numbers. I could use words like yes and no, mild, moderate, severe, or numbers like are you a homeowner or not, 1 and 0, yes or no. But the categorical variables will always be integers or whole numbers. Those will be at the nominal or the ordinal level. There is a very specific form of a nominal variable that is called dichotomous. This is one that can only contain 2 categories. So for instance, pass-fail. If that is the way the grades are organized or structured, you either pass or you fail. You can't do both, you can't do neither. Did you vote in the last election? You're either a voter or a non-voter. Can't do both, can't do neither. Living versus dead, pregnant versus not pregnant, yes versus no, all of these would be examples of dichotomous variables. So when we think about categorical variables, a nominal level variable could be something like your class section. You're in section 901. An ordinal level variable could be something like, are you freshman, sophomore, junior, senior? And a dichotomous variable could be something like vaccination status. Do you get vaccinated or not? Quantitative variables, the scale level variables, are the continuous variables. They indicate an amount. They're expressed in numbers. They answer the questions like how many or how much. And because of this, they allow for fractional amounts. So you could have a number that is between 1 and 2, represented as a fraction, represented as a decimal. What would be an example of a quantitative variable? If it's answering how many, it would be something like hours earned in major. How many hours have you earned so far? Versus height, which would be a measure of how much, or what is the temperature in the classroom, or what is your GPA. Now there's another category of variables that I want to explore. Cross-sectional versus time series. It's kind of the difference between a snapshot and a movie. Sometimes we do a one-shot data analysis, a one-shot data collection. And in that case, we're doing something like a cross-sectional variable. Here's an example of the streaming services and which ones are the most popular. So we see Netflix being the most popular, and we see a decreasing levels. Cross-sectional, all measured at the same time. We're to use an independent research design with this type of data. If we were to apply this to the example that we have from our imaginary stats class, we could say what would be a cross-sectional variable if I just collected test scores. So I'm looking at the scores for test number 2. There's the scores, how many people scored A, B, and C. That's my cross-sectional variable. Time series variables are measured across time. So with a time series variable, we see the same question being asked multiple times over a series of repetitions. This can show us past, present, and future, what has happened in the past historically, what's going on right now, and we can even use that to make predictions. So in this case, there was a prediction that as more and more Americans keep cutting the cord, in other words, they're getting out of using cable and increasing streaming services, at some point that's going to cross, and that was predicted to be around 2023. except it actually happened in August of 2022. What would be an example of a time series variable in our imaginary stats class? Well, that would be, instead of just looking at the distribution of one test, what about the distribution of scores over multiple tests? So we have a test, 1, 2, 3, and 4. What has happened with those test scores over time? And we see that they started relatively high, and they dropped a little bit, and then jumped up again for test number 4. So we're seeing that there is, the class becomes more difficult until we get to the last block, and the scores go up. And this is actually how the tests tend to run, but is not quite as dramatic as the drop that you see right here. Okay. Well, the last thing I want to show you is data sets. This is how we organize all the data, all the variables that we have collected into something that we can use to actually do statistics. A data set is all of the data collected for a particular study. And what we're going to do is take all of those data points and put them into a spreadsheet. And here's the organizational structure. Cases. This would be you and your information. So I have you, I've assigned you an ID number, and I have your information about height, weight, and IQ, and grades, and so forth. That's all going to run across in a row. But if I do that for everybody, all of those rows together allow me to look down a column, and that column represents the height. This is the heights of everybody in class. So if I want to analyze a variable, I'm not going to do it on the row case level. I'm going to be looking at the variable level. I can tell you the average height based upon that variable, which is represented in a column. Now, this data set is one that you'll become familiar with. It's called the dog toys data set. And I'll tell you where this came from. During lockdown, when we were all working from home, and I was teaching online without really wanting to, but that's how it worked out. I wanted to have a data set that I could use for my 237 class that I hadn't gotten from a textbook publisher. So I'm hanging out with the dogs all during COVID lockdown, and that became the inspiration for a data set that we're going to use throughout this course, the dog toys data set. 50 dogs are interviewed, asked questions about their favorite toy. They are given a chance to choose a toy to take home as a gift. We keep track of how long it takes for them to chew up that gift toy. So we're going to be using all of those data points in that data set repetitively throughout this part of the course. And this is actually a subset, a portion of the data set, which I've selected to show you. What we see in this data set are elements. Those are all of the data points. So really each of the cells would be an element. The variables will go into columns. In this case, I have 3 variables. Okay, this will be important because it'll come up on an assignment. That first column, dog, that's just an identification number. In other words, every dog got a number, 1 through 50, so that we could keep track of who was who. That is not a variable. That's an identifier. I have 3 variables. They are number of toys owned, what is your favorite toy, and our note of what was the size of this dog, small, medium, or large. The cases, or the participants, or the subjects, those values are running across the rows, which then allows me to answer questions like, what was the favorite toy of dog number 120? And we can see that it was the chew toy. And for 122, that dog was a small dog. I can answer specifics about any given case by looking at those elements. The data points would be the cells. And then we can look at the variables themselves and talk about whether they are nominal, interval, ratio. Favorite toy out of 5 possible options would be nominal. It's a factor. It is words that represent groupings. Dog size is going to be ordinal, small, medium, large. We know that large dogs are bigger than medium dogs, medium are bigger than small, but we can't quantify the actual size difference. And then number of toys owned would be a scale level variable, which has a 0. You can't have negative number of toys. And so we'll use that as a ratio level, scale level variable. And what we're usually going to be doing is limiting ourselves to scale variables and nominal variables. Ordinal variables are very difficult to use in analyses. We have to have special types of regression models for ordinal regression. So we're going to be using mostly scale and nominal, which allows us to create groupings and then measure something about those groupings. So let me summarize what we've learned. I said I was going to introduce you to statistics. And I started by introducing you to numbers, something you've been using all of your life. But when we organize our numbers, they become data. And when we organize the data, that becomes a variable. If I measure height or anything about you, that is my variable. And finally, when I organize my variables, put them all together, I create a data set. So now we've walked through from numbers to variables to data sets. And that sets us up to be able to move on to what we're going to be learning next, where we'll actually get to apply what we've learned in this stats class. So I want to say thank you for being here, and I'll see you next time.